Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
One of the things Alexander talks about a lot in his books is conceptions. So, what is a conception? He also talks about erroneous preconceptions. And what is a conception? Can you give a definition for people and how Alexander uses it? And also, uh, how does this relate to doing experiments on yourself or doing the work of conscious guidance and control?
Yes, it's a very important word, conceptions, and today the way I want to center the talk is about what Alexander called conception is not a general word out of any practice. It's really situated. So we are going to talk about the problem of our conception in learning to do. And most people that are listening to us understand what it is about, but it's sometimes important, even if all the listeners understand what we are talking about, to make things clear. For some people that would come from outside, from, for example, the other party, which is the modern Alexander technique, is that we are teachers. For example, I am a teacher. I teach, and I teach learning to do, which may sound brutal and may sound strange for people that have this conception of non-doing. No, no. In the initial Alexander technique, we learn to do. The pupil comes and start to learn to do things. So he starts to learn to do using himself. We are not teaching how to use a pencil, how to use a violin, or anything like this. We are teaching people how to use themselves, how to learn to do with the different parts of their organism. And this is important to understand because otherwise we can be lost. And I've discussed last week a sentence and found that when discussing this particular sentence, it was easy to get lost if we lose track of the surroundings of where it is we are placing that sentence. We are placing that sentence in the very midst of this problem of learning to do. So let's go back to last week just a second. So we have this sentence we already have seen that Alexander is talking of a plane, and the pupil comes not to learn to do directly with us, is going to in fact learn how to use plans. We want the pupil to in fact become capable of understanding and applying a plan. So we are not discussing scientific theory in general. That's why I said that some of my pupils are getting lost when they read, for example, an introduction by Dewey, because they think they can't see the point and the connection between this idea of scientific experiments and the initial Alexander technique and learning to do. While in fact, it's exactly what we are going to talk about today. When we speak about conceptions, you have to remember that these are the conceptions the pupil has in his mind. So Alexander talks about incorrect conception or preconception. We all have conception about learning to do. And the point of the lessons is to start making an inroad into this field and show the pupil when a conception is correct and when a conception is incorrect. So the sound plan must prove its soundness in reference both to concrete consequences and to general principles. We are going to discuss principles of coordination, and these principles of coordination, when applied by the pupil to solve particular problems that are set, then there are going to be concrete consequences. And these principles, in fact, must not be judged separately, but in connection with each other. So Alexander placed two conditions. He said, whilst any theory or principle must ultimately be judged by its consequence in operation, whilst it must be verified experimentally by observation and how it works, yet in order to justify a claim to be scientific. So we want to justify a claim that the teaching is in fact of not a it's not an appreciation that the teacher has, it's not a judgment that the teacher would feel of what is correct or incorrect. We want to say that we are working with tested theories, tested premises, and not only are we asserting to the pupil that these claims are in fact sound, that these theories are in fact valid. No, we want the pupil to be able to, in fact, by himself judge, by himself create an experiment. So the theory must provide a method for making evident and observable what the consequences are of using these plans. And this method must be such as to afford a guarantee that the observed consequences actually flow from the principle. So I wanted this week to stress the last part. The theory of the initial Alexander technique must provide a method for making evident and observable what the consequences are. Yes, when we say that, as I said before, we are not trying to say that what we are doing is scientific, and we are not discussing this with the scientific world. No. It's just that we are explaining here the relationship between the teacher and the pupil. When I have a session with a pupil, it's just who I want to provide the pupil a method for the pupil being capable of making evident and observable what the consequences are of his change of conception. We are going to discuss plans, new conceptions, new plans, new conceptions, and we want to, in fact, show that the pupil is capable of making an ocular demonstration. He can, in fact, perform in such a way that we see consequences, and also in such a way that these consequences actually flow from the principle. Because it can be chance, it can be, I don't know, circumstances that are making something possible. No, we want to create difficulties. I said problem last time, where there is only one way to solve the problem of mechanics. It's if you apply the principle. If you don't apply the principle, the experiments are made in such a way that they will invariably fail, and the pupil will be able to notice that any other method he may employ, any other conception he may try to put into practice, will not lead to the consequences that are expected. So we expect the pupil to be able to perform according to a plan. This is the idea. So we are learning to do something. It's absolutely clear. And when we say to do something, the point of being able to do something is not really the point, is not important, in the sense that what is important is that doing this must be proven to, it flows from the principles. It flows from the idea that it's by coordinating a series of movements that the pupil is able to give the ocular demonstration. So we reason from facts. So when we say we learn to do something, well, let's be clear. It's quite simple. There is a lengthening and widening of the mechanism of the torso. This is the central piece. If you can lengthen and widen the mechanism of the torso, the neck will be free. The head will be, you will be able to direct the head in any direction, and a certain number of functioning, like digestion, breathing, circulation, I don't know, mechanical functioning, like organization of complex movements, will be improved. But more than this, the pupil will have had demonstration that he can apply his mind on a series of objects at the same time. He can make decisions that count, decisions that really influence how the organism is seen to move. So that is fundamental, because very often when we start giving these lessons, most people think that it's a physical system for improving the self. In fact, this is just the front. Behind it, there is this idea that what this gentleman is doing, of course, he's got a complex conception of what we mean by lengthening and widening the mechanism of the torso. And what is more important to him is that he's discovered that he can consciously guide and control his own mind. Not his own, well, his own body. This is, of course, the case when you look at this way of sitting. But for him, the point is not to direct the body. The point is to direct, in fact, his own mind. And discovering that there are many avenues, many paths that have not been trodden, that we haven't explored yet. And it's not about the coordination of the parts of the body. It's about the coordination between what we say and what we are seen to do. This is more important. Now, this is not an invention. This is part of the writing of Jeando Alexander. The foregoing will serve to indicate that in the sphere of learning something, or learning to do something, as indeed in connection with all psychophysical acts, all physical acts are not physical, you understand. Psychophysical acts, for example, adding numbers, memorizing a series of related parts of a reasoning. This is a psychophysical act, and of course it's psychophysical because you will understand that in order to make a series of decisions at the same time, quickly, well, you need to have a certain organization of your physical organism as well as mental organism as a basis for this activity of the mind. Well, but for all that, there is an important problem to solve. If we are to progress to that standard psychophysical functioning and use, which will enable us to meet satisfactorily the ever increasing demands of advancing civilization. This is just the introduction. What is important is now, since, as we have seen, the standard of functioning in the performance of any psychophysical act depends upon the conception which influences the direction and control of the mechanism involved. It is most essential to give consideration to this all-important matter of conception in connection with the understanding of what we wish to learn or learn to do, and also in connection with that psychophysical activity by means of which we are enabled to arrive at our conception concerned with learning and learning to do. Alexander is a teacher, and the purpose of teaching is to bring the pupil to discover new ways of organizing the mind and the body together, new ways of, if you want, thinking, new ways of making decisions, new ways, most importantly, of obeying the decision we make. And obeying the decision we make in the orders that was stipulated in the plan. So this is a very wide subject, and it's useful to start from something concrete. And so, as I've said, what is concrete is the organization of the movements of the different parts of the organism. And this, in Alexander's word, has, an expression. It's called coordination. Coordination in the use of the self. And when you see Alexander standing, and we start to analyze what are his movements, so we discover something that is defying our original conception. The standing in his way is at first a real problem for most of my students, most of my pupils, when they come and they suddenly discover what we mean by lengthening and widening the back relatively to a fulcrum, which is the ankle. At first, they are absolutely surprised. It feels like falling. We know that Alexander, said that he learned to direct the use of himself. He learned to direct the coordination of the movements of the parts. And so we also know that he tried to communicate to his pupil what he had learned by using his hands, which is quite strange because he didn't learn in this way. So the question, when you start to want to test whether a plane is really producing what you want, the method for making evident and observable what the consequences are. Well, I observed and I discovered that, curiously, Alexander's followers, who had all learned in the way that is exemplified on the right, did not really understand what Alexander was about. You will see examples during these sessions where, when we observe the conception of modern Alexander teachers, the very physical conception of what it is to coordinate the movement in order to obtain a position of mechanical advantage, you will find that it's very strange, but we are miles away from what Alexander is proposing. So the question is it possible to transmit a plan using physical manipulation? That was my question, and I answered. It's my personal answer. I answered in the negative. I suddenly realized, after my training in the somatic teaching, that our conception of the coordination of the parts was not accurate, was not, even worse than this, was not transmissible. When the pupil started to fend for himself, to direct his own experiments, direct his own use in habitual life, there was nothing of the geometrical quality that Alexander exemplified, or that he showed when he was working with someone. This was really, really strange. Everybody was saying that the real Alexander technique is touch, is this possibility of transmitting knowledge through direct somatic transmission. When I started to work, it was obvious to me that I did not learn a clear conception of what is lengthening the back. I had a feeling of it, and I had a strong confidence after 3 years of daily work with teachers with hands-on teachers, I had a strong confidence that I was feeling the right thing. And that lasted until I started to see myself on video. Then the video destroyed everything, because I could see on screen that when I was thinking, I was performing a series of movements. In fact, I was doing something completely different, and that was not going in the right direction. That is more important. So when you arrive at that point, you will discover that there is something missing. And so what is missing is first the conception of what we mean by coordination. Alexander had found the means of obtaining a condition of coordination that equals a position of mechanical advantage. My impression is that the position of mechanical advantage had been lost. We were sold something that had the name of a position of mechanical advantage, but that position of mechanical advantage that we supposedly learned through hands-on had nothing to do with the one that Alexander was giving. Well, in that case, either it's Alexander is wrong, or the modern Alexander technique is wrong. Well, it's possible that Alexander could be wrong, that his organization of the part was incorrect, and that the modern Alexander teacher with Patrick MacDonald started to have a completely different idea of what Alexander meant by head forward and up. So Alexander had the concept of head forward and up, and Patrick MacDonald discovered that, well, he was wrong. The head forward and up of Patrick MacDonald is not from a spot in the back. It's from the back of the neck. It's quite surprising how this technique evolved, really. But to come back to the difficulty is around the conception of what we call a condition of coordination. And so, of course, I go back to Alexander to examine this idea of adequate coordination. And so we have, by our direction, first to establish the adequate coordination. Then the consent for the end will again begin to work. This is not by Alexander, this is by George Trevelyan after his training. And what he says is quite interesting. It is followed, of course, by a quote by Alexander, but let's have a look first at this idea of adequate coordination. Adequate coordination has to be established before the consent for the end will again begin to work. What does it mean? It means that if you think, for example, that in the adequate coordination you have to think head forward and up. Here, Trevelyan is saying that if you want to consent to having the head forward and up, you must have the adequate coordination in advance. You must be capable of coordinating correctly before giving consent for the end to begin to work. Thinking head forward and up, or thinking neck free, or sitting back to lengthen and widen, if you want that your consent to that idea to work, you have to have an adequate coordination beforehand. So the question of adequate coordination is central. How we conceive an adequate coordination is absolutely central. Alexander then adds, none of my pupils will believe that all they have to do is think. If they would only think, I could make any change, but they will superimpose control by doing or feeling, instead of controlling movement in the process by thoughts, which commands the real means to the end. And this is so important that we need to have it in mind, leave it for a second and come back to it. Adequate coordination. So, Alexander makes a comment, another comment that is quite interesting. He says, those who are fortunate or unfortunate enough to undertake to act as teachers are well aware of the difficulty of finding an adult who can, as we say, think of more than one thing at a time, or perform satisfactorily any evolution requiring the coordinated use of even two parts of the organism. So, in this sentence, I understand that we are discussing coordinating movements of parts. We are suddenly faced with a conception that is quite, well, mechanical in a sense. You coordinate the parts, which means that you coordinate the movements of these parts, and that means coordination. You order the movements. Co means together. So you order the movements simultaneously. So at first, you will discover that the prospect of, think of more than one movement at a time, of performing satisfactorily any procedure requiring coordinated movements of parts. Well, we are not trained for that. We have not in our education system anything regarding this idea of, of course, have an accurate plan. We are not, because of course everybody will see that when a person is standing, is going to stand, the person coordinates the movement of the ribcage object and the pelvis object at the same time, and this coordination, end up with the person standing. It's by moving at different speed the upper torso and the lower torso that the person is able to produce the middle torso forward like this and arch the back, unduly lift, of course, the front part of the chest, and have a sinking above and below the clavicles, as it is the case in this image. All these descriptions have been given by Alexander. So the person is coordinating according to subconscious guidance. It's what the person feels. The person is not thinking of more than one thing at a time. The person is not thinking of the direction of the lower torso. The person is absolutely not thinking of the speed of the movement of the upper torso or of the middle torso. This requires no thinking. The person is just feeling what needs to be done in order to stand. And then we discover subconscious guidance, the guidance by the somatic, cognition, if you want. This understanding we have of our position in place and of the movement we can make, of what we can learn to do physically, that is coming from the feeling sense and the experiences we have had with the feeling sense in the past. Alexander is not talking about this. Alexander is talking of a plan. A plan is something you have in mind prior to performance, of course. And a plan is something that you use both to decide what should happen, in the sense that before starting the action, you have an idea of what you want to obtain. And also, the second idea is that the plan will be used to consciously control whether the consequences have followed from your ideas. That is, you look at how the person is orientated in space, and, you adjust. You control whether the different parts and the different movement of these parts have produced the geometry that was intended in the first place. So when you look at Alexander working with a pupil, you find a geometry. that is the result of a series of movements with the mechanism of the torso. And so you can clearly decompose the mechanism of the torso between the rib cage, the abdomen, and the pelvis. And for example, in this image, we see clearly that the rib cage object has been rotated by Alexander's hands. He has orientated the rib cage. And so this is compared with the result. And you obviously discover that the direction of the movement of the rib cage is absolutely not the same to obtain the position on the right and the mechanical advantage pose on the left. So we have now a way to really assess whether the orders necessary for the elongation of the spine, the freedom of the neck, the other condition desirable for the particular case in question have been performed correctly or not. This is very practical and technical. It's not a question of the teacher's appreciation. And that's where everything lies. We want the pupil himself to be capable of, verifying experimentally by observation how it works. How it works means how the pupil himself will start to have more than one thing at a time in mind. Of course, when you perform a procedure, an evolution, like Alexander used the word, you are going to feel many things, especially if the habitual stance is the one on the right, and you ask the person to coordinate movement to obtain the position on the left. The person is going to feel pulls and stretches and tensions that are not part of his habitual feeling atmosphere. And so how is the pupil to think organized thoughts, different organized thoughts at the same time in these adverse conditions? Because you must understand that the habit of the pupil is to concentrate. And by concentrating, it means that the pupil needs to feel calm, the pupil needs to feel at ease or easier, and the pupil needs to feel is respected. There are all sorts of conceptions that are limitations for thinking. I cannot think because there is noise outside. I cannot think because I have a pain in my back. I cannot think because I have a headache. I cannot think because you're troubling me, or what you're asking me sounds impossible. Very many people, when you ask them to think new conceptions that are absolutely different from their own, it throws them in a state of intellectual shock, as if they cannot think. They can only think of how different it sounds, how impossible it sounds, but not about what the plan is. And so the pupil must, of course, observe how this works. The teacher is there to help the pupil observe how he limits his own thinking. What is impeding his capacity to think of more than one thing at a time? What is impeding his capacity to make decisions in a short time? This is what the sessions are about. The sessions are not about positioning the parts of the organism. The experiment the pupil is making is an experiment about what most people call mind-body connection. I love it when they say this, because I understand something completely different. I understand that there are impediments in really thinking coordinated movements, and it's necessary for the pupil to observe how it works. It's necessary for the pupil to have a method for making evident and observable what are the consequences of incorrect conceptions. This is the plan. This is what the lesson is about. And as you will see, this implies the necessity for the pupil, and not the teacher, for the pupil to start to look at his own conception and test his conception. That is, he must learn to see the consequences in connection with the principles. So I understand this sounds very theoretical. So I've prepared an example using the same pupil. And so here is an experiment where, as you can see, the young gentleman is wearing a book. I have placed a red mark around it for you to see it clearly. The young man is seen sideways and is wearing a book on his sternum. Why is he doing that? Well, it's because I asked him, and I asked him because of how Alexander is seen manipulating the pupil. And this comes from a sentence that was pinpointed by Irene Tasker, where she reported that Alexander was saying that the head was directing forward and upwards from a point in the back. So I started to explore this idea and experiment, and there was something that was absolutely obvious after a few technical checks, is that Alexander is rotating the rib cage with his hands. When he works with the pupil, there is a film, and you will see that more and more Alexander tries to rotate the rib cage object of the pupil. And so a very good marker of the rib cage position in space is the direction of the sternum bones that is at the front of the rib cage. Another is the height of the lowest point of the rib cage as seen on the side. So, well, it became clear that when all the bony parts of the sternum are at the same distance from the wall in front of the person, the rib cage has to be rotated, but also the rib cage has to be like change shape. There is a shape that is associated with lying down on the table, where the sternum is more inclined at the throat than at the bottom of the sternum, just because the first thoracic ribs are very much smaller than the middle torso. The ribs that are beneath the armpit are much wider than the first. And so if you can distort the rib cage and make the upper torso flat, you will find that you get the slant. This slant that you see here, yes, means that the upper thoracic spine is pulled back. Yes, and so I am starting to ask the person to coordinate the movements of the rib cage object. There is a plan. The plan is explained to the person as a rotation. I ask the person to manipulate the book without placing the book on the chest first as a simple object. I ask the person to understand what we mean when the front part of the chest is unduly lifted. It's easier for the person to understand what is meant by a book unduly lifted at the front. So I ask the person to take the book, to look at the rectangle with the long side upright, and I say to the person, what would you do to correspond to the plan of unduly lifting the front part of the book? 99% of the persons are going to solve the mystery and the problem. They are going to, in fact, orientate the book as it is seen on the left, without using their torso, of course, in their hands. Unduly lifting the front means that the back is going in the opposite direction. It's unduly lowered. So you have to lower the back to lift the front. So there is a conception that becomes clear. The words correspond to real, well, concrete movements. And we reason very quickly that in order to unduly lift the front part of the book, it's necessary to create a motion with two opposite movements. We enter into this idea of antagonistic actions. There are two actions in order to rotate the book. And 99% of the pupils are going to, well, finally understand that, yes, that is the case. The next point is a bit more difficult, is that in the conception of the movement of the books, there is also an intellectual evidence that there is, or there must be, a center of rotation. And so the pupil manipulating the book with the hands is going to tell more or less where the center of rotation of the book is. It can be a fixed center of rotation, or it's possible to lift the book and move it to the side, for example, where the center of rotation still exists but is movable. It's acceptable. Then we come to what we call an evolution. So when you say an evolution, you must understand that is comprised in this idea the fact that you're coming from a lower stage to a higher stage. This is evolution. There is another word we call devolution, is when you start with well, a capacity of complex thinking and you return to very, very poor, elementary thinking. So evolution, you have to start from a conception that is really lowly evolved, and evolution means that the conception is getting more and more, well, complex and sound at the same time, more capable of producing the consequence we want to see. So I have tried to show an evolution in 3 pictures. In the first picture, we see the habitual standing position of the person. And I have set at the back of that person a mark that is in space. There is a cupboard that is just behind the person, and I've placed a blue line, and there is a grid that is showing the distance between the blue line and where a spot is placed on the book. Well, remember that the book is on the bony sternum. Each 3 images show the relationship of the torso with the mark, with the line, the guideline. Yes, the guideline is absolutely immobile. The only thing that moves is the gentleman. So the person has this idea that is asked to learn to do something. He's asked to learn to rotate the ribcage object. He's asked to coordinate 2 movements, at the same time thinking about an imaginary center of rotation. And the difficulty is that the center of rotation is a new one. We have discussed together that it was possible to rotate the books from a point that is clearly marked here, but it's marked not on the book. Be careful, it's marked on the mechanism of the torso. If I wanted to mark it on the book, it would have to be at the front of it, because of course we can see here that the ribcage object, this rectangle, a green rectangle for the mechanism of the torso and a pink rectangle for the book. So we ask the person to think of a center of rotation at the very lowest point of the sternum bone. It's a point that the person can locate very easily, touching with the index finger. So there is a first try in B, and there is a third try in C. Well, the try in A is just that the person is standing and doesn't know that to stand, the person is in fact coordinating some movements. The person thinks that standing is just standing. Standing for him is a position. For the teacher, it's not. For the teacher, it's the result of the movements the person does, really, concretely, with the top of the torso, the middle part of the torso, and the lower part of the torso. So, the first try is quite interesting because, as you see, this gentleman is very quickly capable of rotating the book in the direction that is proposed. Yeah, the idea is that in the end we get a movement such that the front part of the chest is no more unduly lifted. Apparently, this is a success. But the teacher is not going to relent here. It's going to, well, applaud the effort, but it's going to start again with the condition of the evolution where it was necessary to think of a center of rotation and two movements. And it's possible to describe, and that's where that sentence of Alexander, a method for making evident and observable what the consequences are. What the consequences are is that the book, of course, has gone forward at the top, yes? And so we see that relatively to the line that is set at the back, we see that the upper torso has come forward. But there is something interesting to see also. It is also seen that the middle torso has gone forward as well. So, the conception of that movement is relatively simplistic. The pupil, to rotate the book, has just moved the lower torso and middle torso forward together. So, if there was a curve in the spine, which is the case, the curve in the spine is still there. Well, we have a new position of the sternum, but the organization of the movements of the different parts of the mechanism of the torso is still fairly simplistic. There is no here coordination of two movements. Both the top and the middle torso have gone forward. And it's possible to make the pupil see this. If the pupil can see it, the pupil can then start an experiment in C with a completely new conception in practice. Of course, the person has the conception of the book rotating with two movements and a center of rotation placed accurately. But that does not mean that the pupil can readily translate this in practice with his own movements. Yet, once he understands what is wrong, and that is explained to him, we see that the upper torso and the middle torso have come forward. Then it's necessary to understand that the requested movement of the book end is obviously quite correct, but the means whereby obtaining the readjustment are not. And so the pupil can start to understand, yes, the means whereby obtaining, yes, the going forward and up with the top of the torso is to produce two opposite movements around the center of rotation. And in that case, what we see is that the pupil becomes capable of having the upper torso go away from the back line, while the back of the back line is staying back. So the back goes back and the upper torso comes forward. This is an evolution of the conception of the coordination of the upper part of the torso and the middle part of the torso movements. So here, this is exactly what Alexander, described as discovering, studying the means of obtaining a condition of coordination. This is what is important is not the position of the book, because you will see that in B and C the position of the book is more or less the same. I don't judge by an increase in 1 or 2 degrees of the rotation. No. The judgment is whether the person starts to understand and start to be capable of deciding to make a movement that he has never felt before, a movement that was totally unknown, but not by knowing what is the result, what should be the result. Of course the result is clear. No. It's not the result that counts, it's the capacity of the person to suddenly organize movement using three ideas, using two antagonistic movement and a center of rotation. So these are a part of the orders necessary for the elongation of the spine, for the freedom of the neck. And it's very, very important to understand that this is a preliminary step. The person must start to understand how the theory is translated in practice. This theory of conception, there is incorrect conception and correct conception. There are, of course, differences. And the difference here is in the complexity of the concept. There are very, very simple concepts of movements in the untrained person. He has no idea that there are bony parts that can be moved relatively to one another, other than automatically, other than spontaneously using the feeling sense. This is using conscious guidance. And conscious guidance becomes possible because of the conscious control that the pupil is capable of performing himself. It's only when the pupil can see what the teacher sees that the pupil is going to be able to evolve, to have an evolution of his conceptions. So this is the start, and so look at the next part. So we see here this position that has been obtained, but yet we see something else. We see that, of course, the rib cage object has been rotated correctly with the new conception, with the new coordination of movement. But what is very interesting is to see that yet still the upper torso, the head is going forward and up relatively to the middle torso, but the lower torso is still not organized properly. We see a rotation of the lower pelvis that is going forward and down, and as a result there is a shortening of the spine. The elongation of the spine is not complete. So it is not sufficient to rotate the upper part of the chest relatively to the middle part of the chest. It's also going to be necessary to organize these two movements with a new rotation, a rotation of the pelvic object. And this is going to be explained to the pupil. The pupil must understand that his discovery is a discovery of how to translate verbal instruction, we call orders, into decisions, how to make these decisions apply in practice, and also how to coordinate more and more decisions. It's absolutely necessary to understand that it's possible to shorten the spine from the top, arching, you can arch the back from the top, and you can arch the back from the bottom. Well, if you want to lengthen the spine, you have to lengthen the spine from the coordination of the two rotation of the chest and of the pelvis. So we have here a very clear representation that the pupil can rely upon to know where he's going. He is performing on his own. The teacher is miles and miles away, so he's just using his own mind in order to obtain the results, and he's using his own mind in order to verify experimentally by the observation of how it works whether the theory is sound or not. And so we say that the pupil is learning. He is really learning. He is not learning to feel different. He's not learning by feeling. He's learning because he's in fact presented a plan, and he's presented a method for making evident and observable what the consequences of the plan he follows are. It's a real lesson. It's not a somatic transmission of anything. It's not an innate sense that is suddenly revealed. We are not there to, in fact, make appear some internal intelligence, internal reflex that would provoke a new result. Absolutely not. It's conscious guidance and conscious control in action. So this conception of the work is the conception of the modern Alexander technique. I had a look at other teachers that were trying, and I applaud their effort. I do not agree with everything they say, and I had a look at the one that were trying to find a reasonable understanding of the principles. And so I've got I took two to show the difference. This one is from a gentleman that is a modern Alexander teacher of Japan. It's called Paul Norikazu Aoki, and he's written a few articles. There is one in 2015, an advantageous way of using the body, introducing a hypothetical idea of voluntary postural control. You can also find his work on the net. It's very simple. You just go on Google, and he's got a website. I haven't got the name of the website here, but finding Aoki or Norikazu Aoki Alexander technique is very, very simple. And he's got an idea of bone weight control in standing position. This idea is that mechanical advantage is the capacity to be supported by the bone structure. So we have here two things. We have, an idea of what is his idea of bone control, weight control, sorry, how to use the anatomical structure and support weight. And we have also some indications of the method for obtaining and controlling the results he proposes. And that's quite interesting to compare with what I've explained of the conscious guidance and control system that I use. So the first thing that we see, I have added the red lines. Yes, I have added the red lines because in the approximate representation of the anatomical structure, we can see that the sternum is inclined backward at the top. The undue lifting of the front part of the chest is there, and of course, as a result, the head is very far backward because if the upper thoracic spine is very far back, well, of course, you'll get the head very far back. And so if you look at where the head is relatively to the hands of Alexander, so Alexander is at the front of the chest, and you will find that the front of the chest, in the case of the student of Alexander, the front of the chest is behind the face. In the case of Norikazu Aoki, we see that the head is much further back. So we have a protruding rib cage. It's quite obvious that in that case, if you understand the rib cage object, you will see that the lowest ribs on the side of the torso, as seen from here, must be very far forward. So Alexander's lower hand is exactly vertical relatively to the upper hand, which means that the rib cage is rotated forward and up at the top, which means that the middle rib cage is rotated back. So we see here that it's impossible because the bone weight control is the idea of transmitting the weight of the torso directly into the legs. There is no idea of antagonistic pulls. It's like a direct support. And as a result, to obtain the direct support, it's absolutely necessary to really rotate the pelvis forward and down at the front and create the marked shortening of the back. So the first realization is like, well, it's quite strange. The observable consequences in terms of organization of support are completely opposite to that of Alexander's. There is no problem with shortening the back. There is no problem with unduly lifting the front part of the torso. Or, I would say, the use is sacrificed to this single idea of having the weight on top of the legs. And so that is the first surprise. It's this plumb line posture that we see very often. And so, of course, the head or the forehead has to be turned forward moderately. And so this is an instruction of movement. Okay, I'm satisfied. Yes, but how are we to control the moderately? What is the point of saying moderately? Not too much. What is too much? What is not enough? It's not evidenced here. Yeah. Then we have another instruction of movement. Lift the head, which is also interesting because there is no means whereby whatsoever. It's just it's an engaging instruction. Lift the head. Place the head at the highest position above the feet. Well, this is self-contradictory in essence. I will explain. Is that if you want the head to be in the highest position above the feet, you must, of course, use the mechanical means at your disposal. And the mechanical means is that if you shorten the thoracolumbar junction, of course, the stature is reduced and the head cannot be sent forward and up as much as it could. And so this is quite strange. That to place the head at in the highest position above the feet, we are in contradiction with the bone weight control. Then it's even more interesting. Lead the body so as to get a sense of receiving a little weight at the shins, the front side of the thighs, the abdomen, and the front side of the neck. So we have an instruction of movement. But that instruction of movement is relative to a feeling. The person is asked to feel to create a movement to feel something. Maybe the moderately, when turn the head forward, the forehead forward, was the same idea, that it's moderate when I feel it is. And here, get a sense of receiving a little weight at the shin, the front side of the thighs, the abdomen, and the front side of the neck. So, you must feel in 4 different places weight. There are no receptors to feel weight. So you must imagine that you feel weight in 4 different places. It's very important to understand that when Alexander was making this comment of the difficulty of finding an adult who can think of more than one thing at a time, well, I suspect he meant think reasonable thoughts, which are verbal instructions. You can think of different instruction. You can think of different rules to be applied at the same time. I have a rule where I want to rotate one object with 2 actions and 1 center of rotation, and I want at the same time another rule where I want to rotate another object, the pelvic object, also with a center of rotation and 2 movements. It's possible to think this. Yet now there is a difficulty because you cannot think of 4 feelings at the same time. I maintain that you cannot feel 4 different things distinctly at the same time. You need words to think distinctly 4 different mental objects. If the mental objects are made of feelings, so you have a verbal instruction referring to a mental object that is a feeling, receiving a little weight at the shins is a mental object that is, well, very somatic in nature. You're supposed to feel something. When you feel one thing after another. You have to. Alexander points to the fact that the somatic system works with what concentrated thinking. You have to concentrate on the feeling at the shins, then you have to concentrate on a little weight at the front side of the thighs. The front, how do you feel weight there? It's just an open question because I don't know. I have no idea how this could be done. And so when you say, okay, there are already 4 orders here, there is 1 for the head, that's 5, 6 because the head is not only to be turned but lifted, that's 6. Then you have to position the buttocks backward until getting a sense of receiving a little weight at the front side of the thighs. 7, 8 feelings at the same time, that's impossible. For me, I cannot at any moment have any idea how you can provide a method for making evidence and observable that the person is feeling so much thing at the same time. So this is a difficulty, and I wanted also to show this example. I've got another one. This one is also quite interesting. The effort is interesting. Yes, it's a representation of a system that is very similar to that of Paul Norikazu Aoki. It's that of Michael Protzel. So there is a website, an old website and a new website by Michael Protzel. It's called upwriting.com. And if you click on Google upwriting.com, you're absolutely certain to find it. Yes, this is just his email address, but the website is upwriting.com. And upwriting.com, this idea is like that of Norikazu Aoki. Sorry, it's like of direct falling. Upwriting, that's an idea. The upwriting system. Mr. Protzel imagined that there is an upwriting system inside the organism. That you must learn to fall directly. That's his great concept. It's very similar to that of Aoki. It's falling directly means that, of course, the weight of the torso is falling directly upon the talus, upon the back of the foot. Well, I have nothing much to say about the positioning of the legs. It's above that everything gets complex, because again you can see that the pelvis is rotated enormously forward in order to get the lower part of the spine exactly above the leg. So it's impossible, and the observable consequences are that the back is going to be severely shortened at the thoracolumbar junction. There is going to be an arch, and you can see that again the abdomen is very far forward of the legs. The upper chest is really unduly lifted at the front, and again the head, as a result of the position of the thoracic spine, the upper thoracic spine is back, so that the head and neck are pulled back. Again, no correspondence with Alexander model, Alexander's plan. So this is to show that transmitting a feeling does not create an evolution of the conception. The very geometric conception of Alexander has been lost, and I really applaud the work of Protzel and Aoki, because at least we can see something. It's not just somebody saying, this is it, this is right, I feel it. I have an innate sense that tells me what is right and what is not, and this is. And the person is going to be, placing his authority in the balance. We are not talking of a method for making evident what the consequences are. We are talking of a person saying the consequences are what they are, and that's what I say, because I am such and such. it's a very dangerous situation where the teacher is saying what is right and what is not, without any need for any method for making evident and observable what the consequences are. So it's necessary for the pupil. And when a person is having lessons with me, I am not trying to justify what I'm doing. I'm just asking the person to establish the means to consciously control that the consequences actually flow from the principle of conscious guidance. The person has to project a certain number of movements, and the person has to check whether these movements have been correctly projected or not. It's not important that I think A or B. What is important is that the person has the capacity of controlling a movement in the process by thought, which commands the real means. The real means are commanding accurate movements of the bony part, the different bony parts. And the person must have this capacity of controlling by himself without the teacher saying, this is it, this is right, this is great. No, the person must be capable of observing how we translate verbal instructions, how we translate instructions that are relating to complex conceptions into practice. Does it make any sense?
Yes. So when you said earlier that people can't be aware of more than four feelings or more at one time, why is it important that all the movements need to be connected together in time like that? So, like, for example, they might just think, well, if you just feel weight here and then the next place, then the next place, they might say something like they're in the flow. So why is what you're saying, why is it important to have all the movements
understand your question.
together?
Yes. It's quite simple, if you want. We start from the fact that standing upright is the consequence of a gesture. When the person is seen to stand, for example, we start with sitting. The person is asked to stand, and the person will go to stand, and we discover then that the person is coordinating a series of movements to produce the gesture of standing. It's obvious, okay? But when we analyze, we discover that these same movements are what are making the standing posture. The standing posture is not... Most people think that there is posture and then movement or gestures are going to flow out of the posture. It's exactly the opposite conception that I have, that I can see every time my pupils reproducing the same movement in order to stand and achieving their posture. If they have, for example, change in the process of standing, the different movement that they normally make when they do that gesture, I just wait for a few seconds, and in a few seconds, suddenly, you can see that the pupil forgets about everything and reproduce a compacted series of movements that lead to standing in the normal way. In order to stand in the normal way, in order to obtain the posture, the person is doing movements. It's possible to show it, because now we have the possibility of contrasting the new position with the old that appeared afterwards, and we can see that the transition from the new position to the old has been done by the pupil very quickly, making a series of concerted movements. So very often I look at it and I ask the pupil, how many movements did you just make? And the person is absolutely surprised. I did not make any movement. I was just listening to you. Upon watching the video of the very short sequence, 3 seconds, the person says, wow, it's not me. I didn't do anything. It happened. Okay, we we have this judgment, you know, where the person has pulled the trigger and say, I didn't do anything. You were the only person in the room, you were the only person with the finger on the trigger. The shot was done. We are sorry, but despite your protest of innocence, you are guilty of pressing the trigger. So the point is, now we need you to start to discover when you're pressing the trigger, what is making you press the trigger, and so that next time you will be able to think in advance and think, do I want to press the trigger, and make the decision conscious. It's just the point of the initial Alexander technique. So to answer your questions, in order to direct 5 or 7 movements, as we've seen, well, it's obvious that it's necessary to, in fact, organize this movement, well, all together. Not only one after the other, but all together. It's what we call coordination. So very often I have people that says, well, why is it necessary to think all these movements at once? Why is it necessary why is it not possible to make one movement and then prepare for the second and then the third? Alexander has an answer to that. I haven't got it on screen to show you, but I will do it from memory. It's a very simple concept. It's a concept of working balance. There is a working balance between all the movements. You will discover that when you start rotating the rib cage, even in the correct way, at first on video, what is shown is that you cannot rotate it without other movements appearing at the same time, and that these movements are very often impeding the result. So you want to lengthen the spine, and so you create a movement of the rib cage object attached to the spine that is going to lengthen the top of the spine. When that is happening, you will see that the lower part of the spine is curving. And so these movements occur at the same time. And Alexander said the working balance is such that if you want to change one misdirected activity somewhere, let's say the rib cage object is not rotated correctly, well, all the other movements that are occurring at the same time are going to fight against your new organization of that part. The only way is to change the organism as a whole, because the organism functions as a whole. So Alexander sometimes introduces difficulty in the thinking of my students, because when he describes thinking in activity, he describes thinking one movement and then applying that movement and continuing to apply that movement while thinking of a second movement, and continuing that while applying the second movement and the first movement together, and thinking a third movement while continuing the two, and then applying the third movement, so that the 3 movements are all together. It sounds better because more simple. In practice, I've never seen it to work. So I do teach my pupils how to coordinate the movements simultaneously instead of sequentially. Does it make sense?
Yes, perfect. That was very clear. For people watching the video, if you have an itchy trigger finger, you'll find a link to Jeando's website underneath. You can book a lesson, and we'll see. Thanks, Jeando. We'll see everybody in the next video. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.